Good morning. Welcome to the webinar, Financial Oversight. What is it for? As part of CDB's, Caribbean Development Bank's Public Expenditure Scrutiny for Members of Parliament project. A warm welcome to you again. We would ask that if you need to make any comments or you'd like to ask any questions, that you raise your hand if you wish to do so by clicking on the hand button. And if you may also insert your comments or questions in the comments section, and we're asking you kindly to include your name and designation in those comments. And could you also kindly mute your audio so that we can minimize the background noise. Thank you. I am Dr. Darren Newman, and I'm advisor. In that position, Mr. Solomon provides leadership and direction to the Economics and Projects Department and the Corporate Strategy Division of the bank. In addition, he spearheads CDB's engagement with its borrowing member countries and development partners. Prior to joining the Caribbean Development Bank, Mr. Solomon held senior positions at RBC Royal Bank, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, the ECCB, and the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. He has also served as District Governor for District 60B, Jamaica Grenada, in 2014-2015 for the International Association of Lions Club. I now hand over to Mr. Isaac Solomon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darren. Honorable Bridget Anisette George, Member of Parliament, Speaker of the House of Representatives, Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, other presiding officers and other honorable members from CDB's borrowing member countries, the BMCs, Dr. Boyendrada Tirari, former Minister of Government, Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and former Principal and Pro-Vice Chancellor, Planning and Development, University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Dr. Rick Steepenhurst, Assistant Professor, School of Continuing Studies, McGill University, youth representatives, management, and staff of the Parliament offices, fellow colleagues at the Caribbean Development Bank, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is indeed a pleasure to deliver brief opening remarks at the first event in the webinar series, which is part of CDB's Public Expenditure Scrutiny for Members of Parliament's Regional Project. This first webinar focuses on financial oversight at the national level and why it matters for Caribbean countries, and must therefore be taken in the context of the broader public financial management framework, which is a critical pillar of our development agenda in the region. While CDB wishes to use this seminar to reinforce the parliamentary oversight of the national budget, its role in protecting the integrity of our democracies, we also want to urge participants to challenge existing paradigms by first acknowledging the value public sector accounting, including budgeting, contributes to the Sustainable Development Goals, including poverty reduction and sustained, inclusive, and resilient economic development. I say economic development rather than economic growth, recognizing that economic development is a multidimensional concept that covers the advancement of people and society across time and space. Time in the sense that future generations ought to be better off than current generations, and space, which suggests a notion of universal coverage where we leave no one behind. With this premise, our parliamentarians need to find ways to legally expand their reach and scope beyond the doors of Parliament, to bring that broader oversight in a way that not only promotes improved fiscal oversight, but mitigates the trade-offs between growth and inequality. The approval of the budget and monitoring its implementation may seem to be a mundane and routine task, especially if you have been doing it for years or even decades. but playing those roles effectively and efficiently and in keeping with high standards of transparency is of utmost importance to a nation's future. In our discussions with parliamentarians and staff in parliamentary offices in the region, we noted that building the capacity of members of parliament to enable them to effectively carry out parliamentary oversight and by extension their constitutional responsibilities with respect to the national budget suggests that there is scope to reinforce the basic tenets and to consider opportunities for doing things differently. Continuous improvement should be the mantra. CDB recognizes the need to support the strengthening of budget scrutiny across its borrowing member countries with a view to improving the effective use of national resources. Hence, the project was designed with the objective of enhancing the knowledge and skills of parliamentarians to understand parliamentary budget best practices in order to deliver a national budget that takes into account the needs and aspirations of all its citizens while enabling the country to fulfill its many global commitments, including the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals to which I alluded earlier. Through this project, virtual learning opportunities are being provided, with today's webinar being one such offering. Other online knowledge products relevant to public expenditure scrutiny and targeted to parliamentarians include a series of short videos and technical material on core principles of financial oversight and national budget management, which will be widely disseminated beginning this week. I spoke a while ago about the need for parliaments to carry out their responsibilities through the lens of an inclusive and resilient development agenda. I would now like to take this opportunity to share a few perspectives on the essential function of parliaments in national and regional resilience building. Everyone listening knows that the need for greater resilience has taken on greater prominence in current social and economic development discourse. Given our purpose here today, I want to speak briefly about institutional and financial resilience in particular. Prudent management of resources is currently a major concern for parliamentary institutions. In fact, the OECD's Principles for Parliamentary Assistance 2012 declared that parliaments are the single most important institution in overseeing government activity, scrutinizing legislation and representing the public concerns to those in power. I add that Parliament is an institutional establishment that is entrusted with the responsibility through its oversight mechanism and accountability tools to hold the executive to account. In essence, Parliament is held to a very high bar to place a certain level of sanctity on what we call the people's money, to prevent squander, waste, and abuse. Recognizing that institutions charged with accountability, such as government audit entities, also report to parliaments. Even with these arrangements, institutional resilience to navigate a crisis can be significantly challenged. We see it with the current pandemic, as many governments have tried to pivot to implement new ways of service delivery. The challenge is for parliaments to meet their obligations for greater scrutiny and oversight, while debating, passing laws, and making quick decisions to respond to the adverse effects of the crisis. The other area I would like to mention is financial resilience. This has been a significant issue for our region, and even more so as we grapple with the surging debt levels. Financial accountability contributes to more financial resilience, and we believe that strengthened oversight roles and responsibilities for parliaments, wider engagement throughout the budget cycle, advocating for responsiveness to citizens, and upholding financial discipline and accountability can contribute to building greater financial resilience. All of this means that we cannot overemphasize how central Parliament function is to recovery and resilience. and I challenge us to take the vital functions of scrutiny and oversight to another level, so that in our respective roles we collectively achieve a more sustainable and resilient future. We do hope that working closely with you, our support through this webinar series and other project activities, can play a significant role in pursuing this aspiration. We strongly believe that it is within our reach. It is against this backdrop that I am pleased to open this webinar series in public expenditure scrutiny this morning. We are extremely pleased to collaborate with the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago and Regional Secretary of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and the Caribbean, the Americas, and the Atlantic, hosted by the Parliament of Barbados, in the planning and execution of this series, and extend our heartfelt thanks. We also thank Dot Group Limited UK, the project executing agency, and CARICAT for being a part of the planning of this webinar series. In closing, I am pleased to introduce our esteemed moderator for this event, the Honorable Bridget Anisette George, Member of Parliament and Speaker of the House of Representatives of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam Speaker is the second female in the history of Trinidad and Tobago to hold that noble office, and she also serves as Chairman of the Public Administration and Appropriation Committee. An attorney at law, she has held several distinguished positions, including Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago, as well as Commissioner of both the Port Authority and the Securities and Exchange Commission of Trinidad and Tobago. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a very stimulating session. I now hand over to Madam Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Solomon, for your opening remarks and your kind introductions. Good morning to all, and I ask that in the interest of time, you forgive me for having resort to the cliched cover of all protocols observed. Today promises to be a very riveted engagement, just 1 hour, concerning a role that we perform as legislators. And I want to respectfully challenge Mr. Solomon in saying that we, in discharge of our role as financial scrutiny of the budget, don't find it mundane at all. As we know, the budget is a very powerful tool that our executives use to achieve sustainable development. It's a primary mechanism for raising revenues and for the allocation of public resources. And for us as legislators, all having constituencies, what we're really about is improving the lives of our constituents. And in the language of Agenda 2030, what we are trying to do is to ensure that no one is left behind. In the course of the hour, I'm sure we will discuss many financial scrutiny tools, but I wish to share with you one of the mechanisms that we use in the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, and that is our Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, which we call the PAAC. Which was established and started functioning in our 11th Parliament, that would be in 2015. We consider the PAC a very critical mechanism in our financial scrutiny processes. And we felt it necessary to fill in gaps that we identified in our scrutiny of the budget cycle. In our PAC, what we really look at real-time, the real-time implementation of the budget. And the mandate of the PAC is to consider and to report to the House on the budgetary expenditure of government agencies to ensure that expenditures embarked upon in accordance with parliamentary approval, the budgetary expenditure of government agencies as it occurs, and to keep Parliament informed of how the budget allocation is being implemented, and the administration of government agencies to determine hindrances to their efficiency and to make recommendations to government for improvement of public administration. So we're really looking at the budget being used by ministries and departments in accordance with the approvals given by Parliament. And we're also looking at efficiencies. Our committee has looked at several issues over its life in the 11th and now in the 12th Parliament. We've looked under broad categories, financial controls, so that during the 11th Parliament, the committee examined the internal audit of ministries and departments and agencies, addressing issues of insufficient or unqualified staff. We've looked at issues as pensions and gratuity payments, which were being paid very late, in several cases, years after contracts have ended or individuals have retired from the public service. The untimeliness of payments was really a cause of concern, and that was examined by the PAC. The committee also discovered the issue of outstanding financial statements by state enterprises that were in receipt of large, significant sums of subventions from central government annually. During the committee's assessments of the written submissions of ministries, departments, and agencies, also we found that there was an issue of non-compliance with financial regulations and call circulars, which we addressed in our public hearings and made recommendations in subsequent reports which were published. We also looked at public administration. And while looking at that, we have unearthed issues of understaffing throughout ministries, departments, and agencies, lack of proper inventory control, and internal audit. We also saw that there was improper monitoring and evaluation practices and processes. So that in the last 3 years, the issue also of the realignment of ministries, because many times when the executive determines ministries are fused or they're disaggregated, and this realignment causes a lot of chaos in the administration of these entities. We have also looked at current issues and issues which were in the public domain and which were within our mandate. So we've looked at, say, COVID-19 and the response by ministries and authorities. We've also looked at the administration of disaster relief and approval of the land use policies and processes. In also taking up issues that are in the public domain and even on the global scale, we have looked at the green economy as a growing global issue and mechanism to handle climate action. One of our real-time examples of our committee in action would have been our investigation, which we began in February of 2020, over a month before COVID actually hit our shores. And we looked at it as an emerging threat and how our authorities, particularly our port, our Ministry of Health, our Ministry of Finance, our Ministry of National Security, how they planned in the event that this virus hit our shores, so that by the time it hit our shores, we were well convinced that our agencies were ready to handle COVID. What it has done is our work has built public trust, because we are in determining our inquiries and in also receiving information. We receive information from the public in our inquiries. So what we've found is that through the PAAC, we've also been able to look at the implementation of the SDGs in our inquiry, so that we've looked at the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services to see how in its grants it deals with social protection as inclusive, covering the life cycle of the vulnerable. We've also looked at how through the grants it aims at reducing inequalities. When we looked at an inquiry into the green economy, we would have dealt with climate action and also dealt with the development of good jobs, economic growth, and also the issue of renewable energies. So that I think at this juncture, having spoken a bit of our PAC, and I'm sure in the question and answer segment, we can delve a little greater into the PAC as a financial oversight tool. I would like at this stage to introduce you to our panelists who will carry on the conversation with respect to how we undertake our oversight of public expenditure. I have the great privilege to introduce our first panelist, and that is Dr. Rick Steepenhurst. He is no stranger to the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. He is an assistant professor professional at the School of Continuing Studies, McGill University, where he oversees the professional development training programs for both members of Parliament and for parliamentary staff, and leads the university's Parliamentary Research Program. Dr. Steepenhurst has worked with more than 60 parliaments across Africa and around the world, and has written extensively on issues related to financial oversight and parliamentary strengthening. His most recent books include Anti-Corruption Evidence, The Role of Parliaments in Curbing Corruption, and Beyond Westminster, A Global Perspective on Public Governance and Accounts. Dr. Steepenhurst this morning will show us what the research says. I now hand over to Dr. Steepenhurst. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's an honor to be part of today's important meeting, and it's a real pleasure to see you again after several years of COVID restrictions and other constraints. I'd also like to say a special hello to some of the members and senators who are with us today, who are part of the McGill community, who have taken part in some of our professional development courses. And I'd especially like to mention Honourable Tracy Panton from Belize and Senator Wade Mark from Trinidad and Tobago. All right, let me share my PowerPoint with you. Let's make this full screen. Parliaments, of course, are required to oversee the development and the implementation of a wide range of policies, ranging from health and education to foreign relations and defense. And we are just wrapping up some research looking at the relationship between parliamentary oversight and democratic development, gender equality, climate change, curbing corruption, and improving human rights. And I'd like to share some of our preliminary views on these issues. Starting with democracy, I'll run through a series of graphs which show the relationship between parliamentary powers, which is measured on this bottom axis, and a particular policy outcome, which is measured on the vertical axis here. And we will be publishing a discussion paper, I hope, next week, presenting all of this research. And in this diagram, you can see that there's a strong correlation between parliamentary powers and democracy. Indeed, it's argued that it's not possible to have democracy without a strong parliament. A strong parliament is a sine qua non for a strong democracy. If I switch to looking at another key policy objective of most governments, it's to improve and to promote gender equality. And here I'm showing a graph that shows the relationship between the number of seats, the proportion of seats held by women in the national parliament, and the equality of rights for women as measured by the UNDP. And here we see an interesting correlation that the more women there are in parliament, the more equality there is in society. I think this begs the question, how and why does this take place? And here we have, we're looking at the parliamentary powers again, the parliamentary oversight powers on this X, and the gender equality index. And you see an even stronger correlation here. The stronger parliamentary oversight, the stronger parliament is, the greater gender equality there is in the country. Let me switch to an issue that's become increasingly important in recent years, and that's climate change. And most governments have made ambitious promises as part of the Paris Agreement of December 15 to reduce various carbon emissions. And when we track the performance of those governments in carrying out their promises relative to the strength of parliamentary oversight, parliamentary powers, we see that there's a the stronger the parliament is, the better the oversight is, the more likely it is that government has actually delivered on its promises. Let me switch to corruption, another key objective of many governments. I was in Trinidad and Tobago a few years ago, and I gave a presentation in Parliament on the link between oversight and corruption. We'll come back to this issue in one of our subsequent webinars, so I won't spend a lot of time on this issue, simply to say one can see that the stronger the Parliament is, the lower is the perceived level of corruption. This is looking at Corruption Perceptions Index put out by Transparency International. And as I say, we'll come back to this in more detail in a subsequent lecture. And the last policy outcome or policy objective I'd like to discuss briefly is human rights and parliamentary oversight. Now, there's many ways that we can measure human rights, and here we're using Freedom House's measure. They measure people's access to political rights and the civil liberties. And again, you see a very strong correlation. The stronger the parliament, the higher the civil liberties and political liberties. Time doesn't allow me to go into more details about this analysis, but I want to make a couple of caveats and then a conclusion. First of all, everything I've shown you today relates to correlation, and correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. It just means that parliamentary oversight and human rights and climate change and so on are related. But that there hasn't been enough analysis and research done on what causes what. However, there has been extensive research done on Parliament's role in curbing corruption and on Parliament's role in promoting democratic development. And it's a very clear and strong causal relationship that Parliament's, the ability of Parliaments to oversee governments strongly results in lower corruption, and similarly, stronger Parliaments lead to better democracy. We need more research on some of these other policy objectives. As I mentioned, the results of the research that I've summarized just now are available in a discussion paper, or will be available in a discussion paper that we'll be posting next week, and we'll be happy to send to you through DODS and through the Caribbean Development Bank if you're interested. But let me make a final thought here, a final comment, and that is when we look at the importance of parliamentary oversight, no matter what the issue, financial oversight is absolutely key. Madam Speaker alluded to this, but let me underscore that. Financial oversight is critical. And it's critical because unfunded government policies aren't policies at all, they're just public relations. Unless allocations are made to achieve a policy objective in the budget, then the policy is all talk. And because Parliament is charged of overseeing all government policies and programmes, the link between the money committees, the public accounts committees, the PAAC, and the policy committees looking at the environment, looking at human rights, the links between the money committees and those policy committees are absolutely crucial. And let me stop there, and I'm happy to take questions at the end of this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Steepenhurst, for setting the table with respect to what the research shows. And at this stage, I take pleasure in introducing our next panelist, who was up to, I would say, July of last year, one of my parliamentary colleagues. Dr. Bo Indradat Tiwari is a former member of Parliament and former Minister of Government in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Dr. Tiwari also served on the opposition bench where he chaired the Public Accounts Committee. He is a former principal of the Trinidad and Tobago campus of the University of the West Indies and former Pro-Vice Chancellor for Planning and Development at the University of the West Indies. He has been a Fulbright Fellow and a visiting scholar at the Pennsylvania State University and authored several publications on sustainable and economic development. Dr. Tiwari is currently the host of a morning program which explores governance and public interest matters in Trinidad and Tobago. Dr. Tiwari, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. It's good to see you again, and I want to say to Dr. Steepenhurst, I enjoyed the presentation very much, and to all of you who are part of this webinar this morning, I want to say a sincere good morning. And I will speak to you. I know some of you are opposition members, but some of you are government members. And it's possible that someone might be a minister. So I will keep that in mind as I speak. Trinidad and Tobago has not just a public accounts committee, but a public accounts enterprises committee, as well as you would have heard Madam Speaker speak to this issue, the public accounts administration and appropriation, public administration and appropriation committee. The differences are that the public accounts and administration, public administration and appropriation committee deals with your current budget and expenditure. The state enterprises committee deals with companies owned by the state, and public accounts is for most of the other things. Public Accounts Committee is captured in the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago, Clause 119, and it is governed by Standing Order 72 of the House of Representatives. I'll quote a little part of the Standing Order, and it helps to determine whether policy is carried out efficiently, effectively, economically, and whether expenditure conforms to the authority which governs it. So that is how we get the issue of scrutiny. What's happening with the PowerPoint? I'd like to share with you so that you can see some of the issues that we are talking about. All right. So the first thing I want to emphasize is that we understand the parliamentary system and how it fits into the whole business of governance. The parliament makes the laws, the judiciary and the court, they interpret it. But besides that, the executive is accountable to the parliament as a whole. And it is important, you heard my colleague speaking before, talking about the important link between parliament and democracy. And therefore, it is important that parliament functions effectively. And what do you account for? Could you have a change? What do you account for and why? How does the executive account to parliament? You have questions, you have motions, you have debates on bills and committees established for oversight. And you have all of those, but the business of budgetary expenditure involves recurrent expenditure, developmental program, current transfers to statutory bodies. You also have public procurement and expenditure by state enterprises. And as I said, the way our system of scrutiny is organized, we have 3 separate entities to look after these issues. Now, why do we need the scrutiny? Because it is taxpayers' money or public money that we are dealing with. And what we are looking for on the one hand is value for money, efficiency, effectiveness. That is what the Standing Order says in the House of Representatives document. But you're also looking for waste, for corruption, for mismanagement if it occurs. Because at the end of the day, the reason why you have scrutiny, the reason why you have an insistence on accountability, the reason why you have the executive accounting to parliament and parliamentary committees to scrutinize matters of government is because you are trying to ensure good governance in your society. Go ahead. Now, the 3 institutions of ongoing scrutiny to keep a government honest. There is the Office of the Auditor General, and that's very important because it's based on the Auditor General's report that the Public Accounts Committee is able to function effectively. Secondly, the Office of the Procurement Regulator. Now, that procurement regulator is supposed to report to Parliament, although we have the legislation and amended versions of it, we do not yet have the reporting to Parliament because the regulations have not been laid. Then you have, because in our system, you really get to Parliament and to government, including the executive, through a political party, right? You have party, you have Parliament, you have government. They are responsible for governance, and these committees are responsible for scrutiny of public finances, public money. The other way that you can know what is happening and hold people to account is if we had a campaign financing monitoring institution. Now, that does not exist in Trinidad and Tobago, but we do have jurisdiction over the general accounts as reported on by the Auditor General under a Public Accounts Committee. Now, what is important to keep these institutions alertly independent? I'm talking here about the Auditor General's Office, Procurement, Regulator, any institution to monitor party finances. They must be autonomous and have comprehensive jurisdiction to do their work, and this must be legislated. They must have financial autonomy and an arm's length relationship with the political directorate. In Trinidad and Tobago, as I said, only one of those institutions we actually have functional now, that's the PAC. But in doing that, the independence of the Auditor General is critical. In our system, for instance, the Auditor General is fairly independent, but highly dependent on the Ministry of Finance to get its work done and to do the development work that it can do. Now, the Public Accounts Committee, what can it do and what can it not do? You know, this is a very, very important question in the sense that it is possible to raise big issues because of the fact that you can bring the Auditor General through the report together with the Comptroller of Accounts in a meeting and have a discussion about whatever is reported in the Auditor General's report, because these two entities are always involved, and therefore you can have serious discussion about issues that have to do with the public accounts of your country. And what can you, just one second, let's go back a little. What can it not do? I think it really cannot make its recommendations happen. If it makes observations and it makes recommendations, you can't really make that happen. You don't know how it is going to end up. You might have a responsive government, a responsive minister. You might have a responsive public service that actually takes the recommendations seriously. But you cannot really guarantee that the work that you do is going to make a difference afterwards. How well can it work? Well, it can work well if you understand that this committee is a committee of both government and opposition members. It is bipartisan in nature, and it includes ministers as well. So it can work well if you create the climate of mutual respect, if you can establish shared objectives in the manner in which you proceed to scrutinize any public accounts that come before you. I don't think it will work well if there is antagonism among the membership of the Public Accounts Committee. it helps that these things are now in Trinidad and Tobago public. That is to say, they are held, they are broadcast on television, so the audience, the citizens can see what is going on. And therefore, it demands a certain kind of behavior without interfering with the process of pursuing matters in a democracy. But I think to make it work well, you have to have a broader framework, and you have to have a shared commitment to making it work. And although it is chaired by an opposition member, and you have government ministers as well, in some jurisdictions, government ministers are not allowed to be part of it. That rule is allowed for backbenchers only. But in our jurisdiction, for it to work, you really have to have it work by collaboration. Some experiences. I had some very good experiences on the Public Accounts Committee. One that was really moving to me was the fact that I had been a former minister in the government under whom Shagarama's Development Authority fell. This is a statutory body. And when the opportunity came to scrutinize their accounts and to have the board and management appear, I asked my committee to excuse me from carrying on with it. And they said, no, not at all. And they insisted that I continued to chair the meeting. And I felt that as a tremendous vote of confidence and the extent to which we had really built something bigger through the Public Accounts Committee. I will have to leave this now and talk about the lessons after. But I do want to say that the Public Accounts Committee can be extremely effective and can make a lot of things happen, although you cannot guarantee that when your recommendations come, that they will be taken and deployed and acted upon by the government agency, whether ministry or otherwise. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tuari. And, you know, I think we've had two very fulsome presentations in the short time allotted to our presenters. And I hope, Dr. Tuari, in the discussion, you'd get an opportunity to look at lessons learned.
Yes.
In terms of, I think, the presentations we were given, certainly the takeaway from Dr. Steepenhurst, the research shows that strong parliaments are sine qua non of a strong democracy. And I think the operations of our PAC in the two parliaments has certainly shown evidence of some of the things that he set out. And certainly as far as the democracy, it means that accountability is real time. There's transparency through the work of the committee. And also there's citizen engagement in the process that we use. I think as far as Dr. Tuari, he's shown us the whole gamut of tools, but also indicated that it is necessary that we get the institutions right. And that even in the absence of the institutions he's pointed out, like for campaign financing and procurement, the role of the PAC and financial scrutiny itself is an important one, a foundational one, ensuring that there is governance. I would like to open up the discussion to our participants. I wanted to say that we should have had a poll to launch off the discussion, but I think in the interest of time, if Dodds and CDB agree, I think we should skip the poll and really go into the discussion. And therefore, if members can use either the chat or the raise hand feature to field their questions or to engage in the discussion. May I ask Ms. Stoker if there are any questions in the chat?
Madam Speaker, there aren't any questions in the chat.
Okay, so, and I'm not seeing any raised hands, so maybe I can pose a question which would help us in our engagement. And I'd like to pose this question to both of our panelists. And it's really, what advice would you give to parliaments where financial oversight committees are not actively engaged in providing financial scrutiny of government's expenditure? And Dr. Steepenhurst, I don't know if you would like to go first on this question, and then Dr. Tiwari. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And you don't believe in saving the difficult questions till last. Very pertinent question. I think that having effective financial oversight is the ground rock, really, for everything else that Parliament can do. Because if the Parliament isn't able to scrutinise the government budget, both in its formulation stage and especially in its implementation stage. In other words, if the government feels it has a free run in terms of what it does financially, then it begs the question, what else can Parliament do? And I don't like to sound negative, but I think there's really very little that Parliament can do. I think that in a situation like that, you clearly have a government that doesn't want to be held accountable, that doesn't want to be to follow procedures of parliamentary democracy, and I think it relies on civil society to demand better government performance. We do see in some countries where governments have avoided Parliament completely, that you get this demand for an action by civic groups to try and hold governments to account, because governments have just swept the rug away from Parliament. So very difficult situation, I think.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Tiwari, may I invite you to join the conversation? Thank you.
Yes, I would say, when I spoke earlier, I said, you know, the kind of, if a government does not allow for a public accounts committee to function, it would be because it refuses to participate if it is already in the system, that is to say in the standing orders. And I think that then becomes a very, very powerful political issue for any opposition. If a public accounts committee does not exist in the parliamentary system, that is another matter. And I think that it is something that parliamentarians could raise in the parliament and debate as a public interest issue. And the final thing is that is why I emphasized at the beginning that although it is chaired by an opposition member, the collaborative spirit and a sense of what you need, what you are there to achieve is important. And I also think having the matter as a public event each time you scrutinize the accounts for an entity, and the public then has an expectation, that can also change the paradigm for public accounts committees.
So, thank you very much.
Madam Speaker, there are now many questions that are coming forward. So I will, shall I read them one by one?
Yeah, Ms. Stoker, I think maybe what you can do is invite, because you have them, maybe you can invite one of the persons to present their question, and then, because time is really short on us, and then maybe we can read them one by one and ask the panelists, given the constraints of time, to try and address them. I would also like to assure all our participants that even if your question is not addressed during the session, it is going to be addressed by the panelists, and the responses will be circulated to all participants. So, Ms. Stoker, please go ahead.
All right. Can I give the floor to the Honorable Maria Dillon Remy, please, with your questions? Please unmute yourself, Ms. Remy.
Okay, yes, okay, fine. Right. My question was to Dr. Tiwari and possibly Dr. Steepenhurst too, where you have recommendations from the Public Accounts Committee not being, let's say, carried out or addressed, and year after year you get the same things, you know, the Auditor General report saying this and they're not carried out. How can you make this thing more meaningful? Is there some way of making the recommendations binding? That's my question.
First, or should I jump in?
You can go ahead, Professor Steepenhurst.
I think this is an excellent question, and it comes up in many cases. And what I'm going to say is a little bit of a heresy in Westminster parliamentary systems. But the most effective example I've seen of a Public Accounts Committee handling this situation is in Germany, outside of the Commonwealth completely. And for many years, their audit committee, which was a subcommittee of their finance committee, just like a PAC, for years, they kept recommending changes to the financial operations of the broadcasting committee. And the broadcasting committee kept ignoring those recommendations. So finally, the finance committee said, enough is enough. We're cutting your budget. In the next budget, the next national budget, your budget is being reduced by 20%. Well, the broadcasting committee very quickly looked at those recommendations and implemented them. And I think that's often the case. One needs to have that kind of power behind the recommendations. And I could go on, but I think in the interest of time, I won't.
Thank you very much. Dr. Tiwari, would you like to take a bite of that?
Very quickly, two things that have been bothersome are the non-compliance of ministries to the Auditor General, and it happens year after year, sometimes with the same entity. So they miss deadlines, they do not conform, they don't get their accounts audited, and so on. And this has been a source of difficulty. And the second thing is that you make recommendations, and sometimes you get responses which acknowledge the value of the recommendations that you made, but give an excuse of why it cannot be done. I think if we had a system in which from time to time, the public accounts reports were debated in Parliament I think it would open up the discussion a little bit and increase the value of the Public Accounts Committee and its recommendations. So I would suggest that. And we should also have something which forces rigid compliance of the public service in its responsibility and obligation to the Auditor General, so that the Auditor General can do their work.
And may I just add here, having regard to the question that was asked by Senator Dr. Dylan Remy. I think we've tried to use our PAAC in that regard, in that the PAAC tends to look at the pervasive issues set out in the Auditor General's report, and also recommendations coming out of PAAC reports when we do an inquiry into a particular entity or ministry and try to address what would be a pervasive issue. So say, for instance, we've seen lots of times the Auditor General may talk about something like legacy items being carried on in a public sector investment program, the DP, and not being migrated to the current expenditure. So we looked at that and we've inquired into that. Things like inventory control, we've looked at that. And therefore, the hope is that while the PAC reports, which are post facto, and which, as Dr. Tiwari intimated, they may be years outstanding, when we investigate the entity or the issue, we try then to limit in our recommendations the recurrence of these issues that have been identified. And I think that is one of the goals and objectives of our PAAC, having regard to the limitations that exist. Okay, so I turn over to you, Ms. Stoker. Maybe you can read one of those questions. I hear we have like upwards of 10 questions waiting to be answered.
Yes, Madam Speaker, there are now many questions coming forward. The next question is from Honourable Member Mr. Claude Hogan, and if he would like to voice his question, please. Just unmute your mic.
Yeah, thank you. The question is to Dr. Bianjada. Why is waste, corruption, and mismanagement not evaluated as part of efficiency and effectiveness to avoid politicizing the issues? Why you said that in addition to the evaluation of efficiency, effectiveness, etc., that waste, corruption, and mismanagement were additional areas for accounts oversight. Why would they be? Why would that be so? Wouldn't that politicize those issues?
I know what he is asking, but I'm not sure what the question demands. What is he saying about corruption, wastage, and mismanagement?
Why would not those be evaluated within the context of efficiency and effectiveness as affecting those areas, as opposed to looking at them separately?
It's not separate. I was just showing two sides of the same coin. If you are inefficient, all right, if you are ineffective, and if you are not delivering goods and services, as you say, to the people, then there might be structural weaknesses or administrative problems that you are dealing with, but there might be other things that you can point to. And I don't think any government should be averse to being scrutinized for waste, corruption, and mismanagement. And I don't think any opposition member or independent member in the Senate should shy away from looking at that as a factor. because the literature will tell us that it happens everywhere, and it doesn't matter which administration is in charge.
Thank you, Dr. Tuari. I would like us, we are now at 11:05. We said the engagement would cease at 11. I hope that Dr. Steepenhurst and Dr. Tuari have a little latitude with their time. And if they do, I would really wish that we can go until about 11:15. I think that would be reasonable so that we can allow some further questions. May I ask Ms. Stoker at this stage to maybe read maybe 2 of the questions, and depending on the time, we may allow somebody else to voice one of their questions. Ms. Stoker.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. The next question is from Honorable Member Nelson H. Cole Simmons. And the question is, how do you address PAC, which are understaffed and under-resourced? And Mr. Simmons comes from Bermuda. And the second question, and forgive me if I have not pronounced the name correctly, please acknowledge, okay. Senator Ferdinand from St. Lucia would also like to raise a question, vocalize his question.
Okay, so can we first take the question from Bermuda? And I will ask both Dr. Tuari and Dr. Steepenhurst to give a shot at it, please. Dr. Tuari, would you like to start? Okay.
For the under-resourcing, I must say that in my experience of 5 years at the PAC here, although resources were tight, the level of competence of the staff servicing the PAC was, in my view, exceptional. So we were lucky, in spite of limited resources, to have that kind of dedication, competence, ability. But it is an issue because one of the ways you make an institution non-functional or reduce their efficiency or effectiveness is to under-resource them. And I think one has to look for that. And again, you see, these are parliamentary committees. And if the parliamentary committees of scrutiny are not allowed to function properly, I think that for whatever reason, I think that the place to make that known is in Parliament and even outside of Parliament, because these are public accountability issues. These are public, what can I say, public welfare issues. So the under-resourcing could be a real problem for government, which is that they don't have the money and therefore Parliament is under-resourced. But it could also be a way of making the committees effective. And I think one has to be very truthful in their assessment of why it is happening and find a solution for it.
Thank you, Dr. Tuari. Dr. Steepenhurst.
Thank you. Let me start by going back to your first question, because it was just 2 days ago I was in a webinar with the Caribbean, and we had a speaker from Uganda, Honorable Dan Ogolo. Ugandan Parliament a decade ago, 15 years ago, was one of the weakest in the world. It had no resources, its committees weren't working, etc., etc., etc. And Dan Ogolo was one of the key reformers that brought together backbenchers from the government party and from the opposition party to say, this institution of ours is important and it's not functioning. There was a bipartisan Financial Management Act that was developed and passed by Parliament, part of which was ensuring the financial independence of Parliament and making sure that Parliament determined itself, not the executive. Parliament itself determined what resources it should have, it needed. But coming back more specifically to the question, I mean, if that big change only can happen once in a while and not in all countries by any means. Some understaffed public accounts committees rely on the staff of the Auditor General's office to support the work of Parliament. Maybe somebody is seconded from the staff of the AG to help work with the Parliament, with the committee. The committee can hire interns. This has been effective in many smaller countries, interns to help with the work of the committee. And in a somewhat different perspective, and I would underscore what my colleague has just said, any of these problems should be aired in public. The Canadian, in Canada, the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, when the Auditor General's report is presented to Parliament, in plenary, in front of the cameras, he asks the Auditor General, did you have sufficient resources to carry out your audit? And if the auditor says, no, I didn't, then the government looks really bad. And so I think bringing on the civil society and making civil society aware of the shortcomings in the system can build that pressure, that public demand for better accountability.
Thank you very much. And I think, Ms. Stoker, we have time for one more question. If you can kindly read it, please.
Well, Senator Ferdinand from St. Lucia would like to voice his question. Okay. So please, Senator, please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Good day to everyone. Very insightful discussion. I just wanted to ask, first of all, I have had the experience in both government now, and I was also in opposition for 5 years. So I have been able to
I think you'll
look at it from both perspectives. The Public Accounts Committee chairperson in session, but I just wanted to ask Dr. Steepenhurst whether there was any correlation in his research, whether he found out whether there was any correlation between the level of autonomy and the resources that are given to the Public Accounts Committee and the quality of financial oversight that the Parliament was able to have.
The short answer is yes. Your answer is a bit difficult because how do you measure the quality of financial management, use of financial resources? We have measured as a proxy for that the evidence of corruption. And there's a strong correlation between the resources made available to Parliament in general, to the Public Accounts Committee in particular, and the level of corruption. The better resourced Parliament is, the better resourced Public Accounts Committee is, the lower the levels of corruption. And if I can just take a second to give an anecdote, when I used to work at the World Bank, many government delegations came through the World Bank and said, we are serious about fighting corruption. And you say, oh yes, and how do you do that? Well, we have a strong Parliament, we have a Public Accounts Committee. Oh, and how well resourced is your Public Accounts Committee? Well, it has a clerk. And you sort of say, well, you know, one clerk, and you expect this committee to be able to function as an investigative committee? It's not possible. And so I think letting people know that Public Accounts Committees are key in the accountability process is the way to demonstrate that. And we'll be putting out some work soon on, and we'll be discussing corruption, I think, next month in this webinar series. So we can talk more about that then.
Okay, so that it's now 11:15.
Thank you very much.
And, you know, it's always regrettable to bring a very engaging conversation to an end. But we do have our time constraints. I want to thank both our panelists. I'm sure no one will dispute that you've been overly generous in your time, in sharing your experience and your knowledge with us. I want to assure you on behalf of the participants that your time, experience, and expertise have not been wasted. For our participants, I am sure that our engagement was not enough. The number of unanswered questions demonstrates that. And the questions which have been asked and ventilated certainly shows the relevance for this sort of engagement and discussion. And I want again to underscore that all unanswered questions shall be answered. To our host, the Caribbean Development Bank, and to Dodds of the UK, I want to, on behalf of all the participants, say thank you for this initiative. Mr. Solomon would have outlined in his opening remarks the objectives. And we have 2 more webinars to go. I think this engagement today is a sort of takeaway from him that his objectives will be met. Where do we go from here? We have another engagement, which is October the 27th. And we talk about what about us, national budgeting for constituents, citizens, and every woman, man, and child. And we certainly look forward to another very fruitful engagement, very participatory, interactive engagement on the 27th of October. For your colleagues who have not been able to join today for whatever good reason, we are reminded that today's session was recorded. It will be made available to all participants so that they can share with their colleagues, and you also use it as a teaser for our future webinars and engagements. Thank you, Dr. Steepenhurst. It was nice seeing you again. And Dr. Tiwari, thank you so much. It was also nice seeing you again. Thank you very much. Pleasant day to all of you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.